Breaking news announcement from the World Health Organization that you should not have any form of sweetener ever in your life ever again. Okay, that's a little bit of hyperbole, but we're going to be talking a little bit about the article that just came out on CNN. I think also the World Health Organization put out a statement today in a press release basically saying that you should not have any sugar substitutes. We're going to talk about that in depth on the podcast today. But before we dive into that, we're going to talk about Peloton because they released their quarterly earnings reports. Kind of interesting. We talked about this earlier in the year. Want to give you guys an update on that. And it's going to be a fun show today. But before we get started, I want you guys to just take a minute and go ahead and subscribe. Click the subscribe. Click the little alert bell so you get a notification every time a podcast is dropped. And we probably have some big updates about the podcast, the platforms it's going to be on, the name, etc. I'm just waiting to hear back to get the green light from our marketing/SEO people. But we have some big updates coming very soon. So without further ado, drum roll, please. There's nobody here to give me a drum roll. We're going to talk a little bit about Peloton. So if you guys have been following the podcast, or if we look at, or if you've been following Peloton's story over the last few years, is basically they had a huge boom selling tons of bikes over COVID. Their business crashed, demand fell, the cost of producing Pelotons got way too big. They were losing a ton of money, and basically as soon as the demand stopped, and we've talked about this before, I'd say go back to our previous episodes and look for more details on it. But after that demand dried up, they were bleeding so much money so fast that they were on kind of the fast track to going bankrupt if they didn't make changes. So they did a kind of a regime change. The original founder CEO stepped down. They replaced him with a new CEO, and his goal was really to kind of right the ship, right? Is, hey, how do we turn this business from we built a huge brand, it cost us an infinite amount of money to build this brand. Now, how do we make it sustainable? I would recommend that you go and you read the full shareholder letter, which I'll put in a link in the show notes here. But really kind of an interesting pivot. So basically, to kind of sum this up a little bit, is Peloton decided, hey, we're really going to become a interactive digital company. The bikes, the rowers, the treadmills, all those things are going to be a way our users interact with us. They're not going to be our primary business model. We're going to shift away from being a fitness product business to a fitness service business. And so want to talk a little bit about that. And so if we look at the 10Q from Peloton, which is basically their kind of financial reports, pretty interesting to see how much they've shifted. So if we look at the fiscal kind of year for Peloton, which they do their fiscal year differently, it's not January to January, but the 9 months of the last year's first 3 quarters, this is really interesting. They sold 1.9 billion, I think is the way to read this, in their fitness products, which is their treadmills, their bikes, things like that. And they sold 1 billion in their subscription. So every time you buy a bike, you get a subscription with it, right? Now, the 9 months of this year, they sold 900 million. So they sold half as many bikes, but they sold 1.25 billion in subscriptions. So they've sold more subscriptions, but they've sold half the products, which means they're really driving their subscriber business. And so that means their total revenue over the first 3 quarters last year was 2.9 billion. This year it was 2.16 billion. But the cost of that revenue is down from 2.2 billion to 1.4 billion. So they actually have about the same level of margins, although their gross profit is about the same 9 months over 9 months. Now, if we look at the last quarter specifically, what we saw is they are now selling more subscriptions than they are connected fitness products. Their total revenue, right? So they're actually selling, they sold about 424 million in subscription revenue versus 324 million in fitness products. So they're really dropping off on their fitness products, and they're really focused on their subscription revenue. And what's interesting is their gross revenue quarter over quarter went up $100 million. And this is also on, they've spent less money on sales and marketing. And they have spent way less on kind of restructuring the business. So this is still a crazy number. Their operating losses in the first quarter of last year was $740 million. So Peloton lost $740 million in the first quarter of last year. This year they only lost $266 million. So that means they are, getting much closer to break even, to profitable. So they've made huge strides, and it's all in the shift from kind of selling their bikes and their treadmills and their rowers to, can we become kind of a brand and a digital, business, so to speak. So really interesting to see how that changes. Now, I'm guessing that's going to be even better in the next quarter because they've kind of taken the losses they've needed to take on a lot of their fitness equipment, and they've kind of sold it at a loss because they made so much of it that they just had to liquidate it. Part of that was for cash flow reasons, right? If you have a bunch of cash tied up in, like, let's say you build $2 billion worth of inventory and you can't sell it because it's priced too high, you can't use that money, even if it's at a loss, right? So if you cut it in half, like if you sell it for half price, sure, you take the loss, but now you get $1 billion back in cash that you can go then produce more content and get more subscribers, or you can spend it on marketing. It's not just locked up. It's kind of like equity in your house, so to speak. So pretty interesting to see how much they've changed. They still have, they're starting to face a cash crunch, though. That's the only big piece. So if you look at their cash flows, their net cash is starting to dwindle. So they just need to make sure they can't keep operating at these $250 million losses as part of their core business. So if we look at it year over year, their cash position dropped, about $500 million, so to speak. Their inventories are about half. So their balance sheet is, shrinking substantially. But the biggest part of that is their liabilities are shrinking too. So they're really just trying to right size the whole business. So that is the update on Peloton. Now let's jump to this article that came out in the World Health Organization. I'm going to read this. I'm going to read this whole CNN article. It's not all of it. I'm going to read a large chunk of it, just the headline. It's probably the first half a page or so. And then I kind of want to talk a little bit about just why perspective and context is so important. So this article is titled, Don't Use Sugar Substitutes for Weight Loss, World Health Organization Advises. So this is the article from CNN. It reads, Don't use sugar substitutes if you're trying to lose weight, according to guidance from the World Health Organization. The global health body said a systematic review of the available evidence suggests the use of non-sugar sweeteners, or NSS, does not confer any long-term benefits in reducing body fat in adults or children. This review also indicated that there might be potential undesirable effects from the long-term use of sugar substitutes, such as an increased risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Replacing free sugars with non-sugar sweeteners does not help with weight control in the long term. People need to consider other ways to reduce free sugars intake, such as consuming food with naturally occurring sugars like fruit or unsweetened food and beverages. Francesco Branco, World Health Organization Director for Nutrition and Food Safety, said in a news release. Non-sugar sweeteners are not essential dietary factors and have no nutritional value. People should reduce the sweetness of their diet altogether, starting early in life to improve their health, Branco said. The organization said its recommendation applies to all people except those with pre-existing diabetes. This new guideline is based on a thorough assessment of the latest scientific literature, and its emphasis that the use of artificial sweeteners is not a good strategy for achieving weight loss by reducing dietary intake, said nutrition researcher Ian Johnson, emeritus fellow at Quadrant Institute Biosciences, formerly the Institute of Food Research in Norwich, United Kingdom. However, this should not be interpreted as an indication that sugar intake has no relevance to weight control. Instead, one should cut back on using sugar-sweetened beverages and try to use raw or lightly processed fruit as a source of sweetness. Dr. Keith Ayoub, scientific advisor for the Calorie Control Council, an international association representing the low-calorie food and beverage industry, told CNN via email the WHO's insistence on focusing only on prevention of unhealthy weight gain and non-communicable diseases is at the very least misguided. Robert Rankin, president of the Calorie Control Society, said, low and no calorie sweeteners are a critical tool that can help consumers manage body weight and reduce the risk of non-communicable diseases. So I want to dive into this a little bit because this can seem a little bit confusing in some aspects. And this is one of those situations where I don't know how to say this without it just sounding really bad. I think sometimes the people in charge have completely lost the picture, right? I mean, I think about the director for the Nutrition and Food Safety saying some of these things, Francesco Branca. These are either way out of context, or this is somebody who either doesn't fully understand the literature, which they should in that position, or has never worked with people in general. And I've written and talked a lot about artificial sweeteners, and I think there's a lot to unpack here. And I'm just going to give you, my perspective. I would say I'm relatively unbiased, right? I don't sit on the Calorie Control Council, so big sugar doesn't pay my bills. The WHO trying to push an agenda doesn't pay my bills. I'm completely independent, and I just want to tell you what I think based on what we know about the literature. I think the reason the WHO in their report came to the conclusion they did is I don't think they have a full understanding of the research they're looking at. And I go back to a couple of the studies that I've looked at and I've discussed on this podcast previously is if you take observational data, you take cohort data, and you look at the people who consume the highest amounts of, non-sugar sweeteners, aspartame, Splenda, stevia, whatever you want to call it, whatever it is, versus the lowest consumers, you almost always find that the people who consume the most of those generally have higher rates of obesity and higher rates of diabetes, because as goes obesity, so goes diabetes, right? That is the pathophysiology of that disease. But the problem is all those risk factors cluster. The people who tend to consume the highest amounts of non-sugar sweeteners are also the people who consume higher calories, already have a higher BMI at baseline, are less physically active, drink more alcohol, smoke more. So it is a feature of the lifestyle that all of those factors contribute to driving chronic disease. It's not that single thing. And we kind of use this as a independent risk factor, but it's not really independent, right? How many people do you know? If you were to take 1,000 people and you looked at the people who consume the highest amounts of Diet Coke, they probably also have a host of other unhealthy habits, right? The people who exercise a lot, eat really well, don't drink, don't smoke, manage their stress, go to bed early, choose to live somewhere where there's not a lot of pollutants, they take their vitamins every day. Like all of those things, they maybe have a Diet Coke or two, but they're not drinking 5, 6, 7, 8 a day, right? So that seems like a small thing, but that's also a very large portion of the research that drives these things, right? The other side of the coin is if you look at the interventional research and you take people and you swap out their regular Coke for a Diet Coke, they lose weight. Whether it's a huge amount or a small amount, they lose weight. That in turn lowers the risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, etc. And so that's the other side of what you have to look at. And if you actually go into the World Health Organization's report, you kind of see these case control observational studies show all these bad things, but all the randomized trials show all these, potential benefits of like, hey, here's what we see. So for them to come out and kind of suggest that we should remove all of these non-sugar sweeteners in our diet is, one, I think based on a not great interpretation of the research, and two, not living in the real world. Like, I consider myself a relatively healthy person. Like, I own and run a nutrition coaching company. I've done nutrition coaching for 15 years. I make pretty good food choices. Am I perfect? Absolutely not. But like, I still I'll have a Diet Coke on occasion. I'll use non-sugar sweeteners on occasion. Like, I will have a protein powder that has, a non-sugar sweetener in it so it doesn't taste super bitter. But I'm not consuming huge amounts of them. And so I think when you look at something like this that's put out, it's a bit concerning, because I think the average person who reads this then all of a sudden goes, oh my God, I should probably be using agave sweetener versus, because it's natural, versus the aspartame. It's like, well, now you've just added 200 calories back into your diet, right? Maybe you're trying to lose weight, so that's actually not super helpful. So these things are always very context dependent, right? Just saying, hey, we should remove all of these from our diet and that they are not health promoting, it's not correct, right? And then when they say, hey, non-sugar sweeteners do not confer any long-term benefit in reducing body fats or children, it's like, have you really assessed the randomized trials? Probably not, right? And if you say, well, in the follow-up studies, all those people regained weight, it's like, well, that's every weight loss study, right? So then it's like, well, then don't ever follow a Mediterranean diet, because most of those people regain the weight. Don't follow any sort of calorie restrictive diet at any point. Don't do anything. Don't exercise. Don't change your diet. Don't start walking more, because as soon as you stop those habits, the weight loss returns. So there's no long-term benefit. So this is a little bit crazy for me to see an article like this come out, especially then if you go read the report. Like, you can actually look at all the meta-analyses, and it actually looks to me like, here's what we generally see. Among people who consume very high amounts of non-sugar sweeteners, they tend to be unhealthier than people who don't. It's not because of the non-sugar sweeteners. It's because of all the other things that they do in their life that cluster all of these risk factors. Now, when you take somebody who has all of these unhealthy behaviors and they're currently drinking or they're using a sugar sweetener and you replace it, they actually end up losing a little bit of weight in the short term because you've reduced their calories. Now, if they don't make any other lifestyle changes, they're probably going to gain that weight back because they're going to find some way of bringing those calories back in, right? We know that that happens. So I don't think we need to, this is not a fundamental change in our understanding of the literature, right? The literature still says the same thing. If you actually go look at the report and you look at the data, that's what it tells us. The narrative of, hey, nobody should be using these and they have no nutritional value and we should just not use them, kind of misses the mark. Now, the one thing I will say in here that is some sound advice is the quote that says, people should reduce their sweetness of their diet altogether, starting early in life to improve their health. I think there is wisdom in that, because if you look at, it's not about the sweetness per se. It's about the overall palatability and stimulation of our diets, right? If you from a young age develop a palate of things like simple foods, apples, salads, protein, nuts, seeds, potatoes, rice, like plainer, simpler foods become enjoyable to your palate, your likelihood of consuming hyper-palatable, energy-dense, super sweet food decreases, right? I'm sure a lot of you guys have noticed this of if you ate fast food every day for years and then you immediately switch to a different diet, right? Initially, that food's going to be bland. You're not going to like it. Eventually, you start to like those new foods. And then you go back and you have, you go to McDonald's, you're like, oh my God, this is so overwhelming in its flavor and intensity. Like, I don't even like this anymore. So I think there's wisdom in that. But I think the headline here of don't use sugar substitutes for weight loss, I think really missed the mark. So hopefully we can have some discussion. Let me know your thoughts on this topic. I'm not saying everybody needs to consume artificial sweeteners. If you don't choose to, great. By all means, continue doing that. But I think to say they're not useful tools in certain situations, I think really misses the mark. So let me know your thoughts. Would love to get some feedback from you guys on this topic. Your thoughts on the Peloton topic. Shoot me a message. Find me in our Facebook group, which is Macros Inc. on Facebook. Comment in the video below. Would love to hear more from you guys. I'm Dr. Brad. I will see you guys in a couple days on the next podcast.